Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this UKFPO webinar. As you know, we run a series of webinars aimed at foundation doctors and foundation supervisors. I'm Tony Chills, I'm advisor to the UKFPO, and I have with me this afternoon Mike Wilson from the MDRS Careers Group and Janet Sinclair, who is one of the Northern Foundation Careers Advisors. Mike's going to be talking you through the event. We'll have a live QA session going as we run, so please put questions in the chat and Gemma will be trying to answer them, and then hopefully we'll wash up with a few questions at the end. This is an introduction to careers. Hopefully it will stimulate people into thinking about careers, thinking about it as a little bit more than just a choice of specialty, and hopefully signpost people to some very useful resources. So I'm going to hand over to Mike now.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Tony just mentioned there, my name is Mike Wilson. I'm the Head of Careers in the NHS England North East and Yorkshire. And I'm going to talk to you roughly about 45 minutes, just to kind of set the scene in terms of careers and career management. I appreciate that some of you may be F1s, some of you may be F2s, and therefore I've tried to make this as generic as possible and hopefully as useful as possible for everyone as we go through. I am going to have some time for questions at the end, and so if there is anything that you want to talk about then do let me know. Now, as always, it's going to be a bit of a techie issue when I try and share my screen, so fingers crossed this presentation works, so bear with. And if someone could just give me an indication if that is now on their screen, that would be great. Fabulous. So just kind of, I wanted to set some context before I started on this. So I think, you know, often when we talk about careers, and particularly careers for doctors, it's often kind of conflated around choice, around kind of career structure, you know, specialty training, etc., etc. And I guess what I'm here to say to start off with is that, you know, I'm not here to try and convince anyone to do the next step as is stepped out. I think what I'm here to talk about is how you negotiate that way through in the way that's best for you, and hopefully with some hints and kind of the things that might be useful in terms of going through whatever the next progression point is that you want to go through. And I kind of want to emphasize want to go through rather than necessarily have to go through, because this is ultimately your choice. So I guess I've got kind of two hats here. One is I'm a careers advisor by trade. I'm not clinical. I've worked with postgraduate doctors since 2008 now, but I'm also a qualified careers advisor, as is Gemma, who's come along today. So we've got no real agenda in terms of this. We're not here to try and recruit for anyone. The other thing that I wanted to kind of just explain a bit about was this whole concept of the MDRS Careers Group, and the majority of you will probably have no idea what this is about. But I think it just sets some context that people do talk about this and the importance of this for yourselves. So my kind of role in that group is as the business manager and co-chair of the MDRS career subgroup. MDRS will mean nothing to any of you, but it's a group that works around recruitment and selection, and has a subgroup in their careers, which is a 4-nation group. So that includes representative from all 4 of the UK nations, and has a whole range of clinical and non-clinical people on there. Why am I telling you this? Why is it important? Just so that you know, I think that these kind of things we do regard as important. So I guess just to kind of explain where I'm coming from here, if my slides will move forward. Oh, here we go. So I think one thing just to make you aware of, and you probably didn't know this, and if you did, congrats, because not very many people do, that there is a career strategy for postgraduate doctors and dentists in training. And I just wanted to kind of raise this for you because it does highlight the kind of things that would be useful in terms of provision. However, I think it's worthwhile saying that this is a guidance document and it's not mandatory. But you can see there that there's a recognition that careers is really important for all doctors, and particularly for doctors in training. And of course, recognising here that as part of the foundation curriculum, there is a careers management outcome there, which you have to demonstrate in terms of your portfolio outcomes. So I think, just again, the reason I say this is just so that you know that we talk about it and we understand its importance, and we try and kind of negotiate ways that are going to help yourself. I think the other thing which it would be wrong not to kind of talk about and set in context is that there's been a huge change in the last 3 or 4 years around how people progress, and that was due to the pandemic. Before then, there was kind of a lot of people who would go overseas, there was a lot of people who would kind of do different things, and then the pandemic kind of changed that and reversed that. But that wasn't just about recruitment trends, and I think one of the things that we wanted to look at was, what impact is this having on career choice? So this is just some high-level messages from some research that we conducted as part of the MDS Careers Group around what impact the pandemic was having on people's career choices. And I think the key messages are there for you to have a look at, but the main thing I wanted to draw your attention to was this recognition that actually everyone's experience during this was individual. And I think because of that, that's reflected in people's career priorities. What we found was that a lot of people who responded to this, and there was over 2,000 responses, and was around how individuals felt that they would change it depending on changing priorities, particularly around things that were not traditionally seen as priority areas. So it was very much about work-life balance. It was very much about kind of, I guess the personal side of things in terms of careers, rather than what we would regard as the more traditional things around kind of like, status and all that kind of stuff. So again, I think just to recognise that for some of you, this will have an impact, and it's about recognising that and understanding that is now kind of recognised from our point of view as well, certainly from a careers perspective. Okay, so in terms of careers, some of you might have already made decisions. You have all already made decisions, and here I've kind of put a route map of your life thus far, and kind of put where some of those career decisions have been made, or where ostensibly they were made or should have been made, I guess. And of course, you had the initial decision of, well, I'm going to do medicine, or do I want to do medicine? I think I'll do medicine, and going through that decision process of applying and getting into medical school. Then there was a whole decision around where do you want to do foundation training, what kind of content did you want in your foundation training. Then the next one will be in between F1 and F2, which is around kind of, what do I want in terms of progression here? What kind of things do I need to concentrate on? And then there's that natural break at the end of F2 where it's, okay, well, what else? What next? Now, in terms of the traditional pathways, there it is for you. It's in specialty training and then out the other end. However, I think one thing to recognise is that actually not everyone does that, and increasingly it's the minority that do that, and the majority go on and do different things, and that's not a bad thing. Again, I come back to the point that I said earlier, which is this is about you and it's about what's important to you. Of course, it doesn't just stop there. And I think one of the things to recognise is that whilst we understand the importance of getting the next step right, this happens time and time again. So if, for example, you go into a core specialty, then you'll be thinking about, well, what do I do after that? If you're going to something that's you go either travelling or you take a break, or you go into a local employed doctor role with a view to come back to training later on, again, what will it be when you go to? And then increasingly recognised as another key pinch point is the decision at the end of training, which is, do I want to be a consultant? Because I think one thing to remember is that when you get to the end of training, it's not mandatory. And for some people, they don't want to do it full time. They don't want to do it, they want to do it as part of a portfolio career. Their priorities might change. And I think one of the things that I've recognised over many years is that life throws curveballs at you, and whatever you think of your kind of plan all the way through might not necessarily end up the way that you expect it to, and therefore it's just to be prepared for that. And I think hopefully what I'm going to talk about will kind of put that in context. So if you take that career structure in terms of what is currently recognised as the training structure, it's very stepped, staged, clear, defined. This is what you do. This is how long it's going to take. This is how you're going to progress. Now, I'm going to make the logical, or maybe it's not logical, assumption that based on the audience and kind of my rough guesstimate of your age, you're probably all part of what we're classed as Generation Z. And I'm putting this up really just to pick up on a couple of things. One, this is based on some research that was done within the healthcare sector. It was a good few years back now, and what it did was it kind of tried to look at what the main, I guess, contrasting areas were between the generations. And one of the things here, particularly around this one, is this need and recognition to have flexibility and the ability to do things at your own pace and your own time. And so you notice there, one of the comments there, don't force me into a traditional pathway because I'm not engaged. I think this is playing out in terms of what's on offer. You think about a very, very rigid progression opportunity in terms of specialty training, one, recruitment process a year, one or two start dates, depending on which specialty it is. You do things at a certain time. It's all on their timetable, not on yours. So it's no wonder that I think a lot of people are kind of changing when and where they engage with this. And I think this is again slowly being recognised with some of the flexibility agenda. But as I'm sure you're aware, healthcare is a very slow sector to change, and so a lot of this will take time to filter through. But it's something that I'll keep on talking about in national meetings around. We need to start thinking about how this will change, because what we're offering people don't want, or they don't want now, and they want it at their own pace, and we can see that in destination data. Okay, so in terms of what is important from a kind of career decision basis, there are many, many, many different career development cycles. Some of them have 3 stages, some of them have 4 stages. Essentially, it doesn't really matter which of these you want to, because they've all got pretty similar stages in there. Now, where most of us start off on here, and myself included, is stage 2, which is that whole concept of opportunity awareness. So what is out there in terms of, if you think about foundation trainees, okay, so what specialties can I apply for? What are the options outside of specialty? When do I apply for them? What's the competition ratio? How many posts are there? That kind of stuff, which is fine and natural, and that's the kind of starting point where a lot of people will go to. But actually, the reality is, we shouldn't start there, although a lot of us do. We should kind of start off with what is important to us, what do we like, what do we not like, what are the kind of things that give us a level of job satisfaction, what are the things that give us the motivation to get up and go to work at the end of the day. That might seem like obvious, but many, many people don't do that. And I completely understand why. You work in a very pressurized environment. You've got a lot of things to cover. You've got a lot of things to work at. And having the time and space to take a bit of a step back and think about what's really important to you from a careers perspective can take a bit of effort. But it's really, really important. And actually, that's what I'm going to talk about most of this afternoon. And I'll try and explain as I go through about why this is important. Unless you already know and I've already converted you, which is great. And then you can just kind of like passively listen for the next 40 minutes. So Why is this important? Well, I think for two reasons. For me, there's a very big difference between what I would class as a job and a career. So a job is something that you do because it pays your bills. So I've got a mortgage to pay. I want to be able to go and do the things I enjoy doing with my life, which invariably cost money. And so a job is something that you've got no real personal investment in. And it may be that in some of your foundation rotations that you've done so far, some of your rotations have been what you would class as a job. And it's like, well, I'm doing it. I'm not really necessarily enjoying it, but I'm obviously being able to manage some of my curriculum outcomes. And I'm also trying to kind of learn what I need to learn, but this is probably not going to be for the long term. And it's given us a wage, which is quite nice. A career is something that gives you that level of personal satisfaction, and I guess some of that, I guess, feedback. When you go and you feel like you've done something worthwhile, and that's very individual depending on what people find as their kind of motivation. So from an altruistic point of view, it's really important to kind of reflect on what is important to you, in order to then find something that is going to be really valuable in the longer term. And I guess for those of you who may already have done this and are in the process of applying, if you're an F2, what are the practical applications of doing this? Well, you're going to go through a recruitment cycle. And unlike some of the recruitment that you've had fairly recently, this is very much going to be predicated either on your commitment, and that's not necessarily around activities that you've done, but your suitability to that particular training post, or your suitability to that particular job in a trust if it's something like teaching. And then certainly as you get further on and towards kind of applying for senior grades, it's going to be around, okay, well, why do you want to do this? What is your personal reasons for this? And so having an understanding has a practical implication in terms of progressing onwards from there. Now, there's kind of obviously another couple of areas here, so not just one and two. You've got the whole process of making decisions and then planning that. And I would probably say that career decisions are ones that people reach at different stages, and that is fine. Some people will go into foundation with an absolutely clear goal of where they want to go, and that is fine. Some people will go in and have absolutely zero clue and will take some time to come to that career decision. Again, fine. One way is not best. It's about what's best for that individual. And obviously the final bit is getting in there, which is, I guess, all of the recruitment and selection and doing that successfully. So hopefully that sets a bit of context in terms of a process that you can go through, with the onus very much on that whole self-awareness, reflection and evaluation of what's important to you. Of course, this will be something that's familiar to you because you'll be doing reflection as part of your foundation training. And so one thing to I guess as a starting point for this is, well, how do you feel about what's going to happen to you after F2? I say what's going to happen to you after F2. What are your opportunities after F2? I suppose I should say, which is more accurate. And here's just some ideas here. So it may be very well a clear and steady road ahead, and you know where you're going, and you know what you need to do to get there, and you may already be on that path, and that's fine. It could be that you're looking at the sunny uplands of saying, right, okay, well, it's great. I'm going to be finished foundation. I'll be able to do what I want to do, whatever that might be. You might be looking at quite a congested road ahead, with the view that, well, I want to apply for something that is really competitive, and how do I make myself stand out from that? Bit of hint that I've just said there. It's not just necessarily about exams and being able to show bits of paper. It's about showing that personal commitment and investment, which is about how much you've thought about it. Is it a long and winding road that you can't see the end of? And I completely appreciate that, because it does seem like quite a long time. Is it one option or many options? And I guess the thing is that none of these are wrong, except possibly for the car crash, which hopefully that's not how you're thinking about it at the moment. And I guess one thing just to point out that this process that I've just talked about there in terms of self-reflection, evaluation and opportunity awareness, part of that is thinking about, well, what else or what if? because sometimes medicine isn't for everyone, and people realize that at different stages. And of course, if you're in that position, then being able to kind of articulate why you think that and why that's important to you is going to be really useful as well. And in terms of career decisions, I guess it's, as I said earlier, people make it for in different stages and at different times, and with different information, and people trust different information. And a lot of these are kind of common themes that we hear, particularly when asking, you know, and speaking to doctors in training about kind of career decisions, or any decisions really, to be fair. And I guess some of these you might recognise, some of these you might think, well, no, that I've got different ones, and again, that is perfectly fine. I guess what I would say here is that all of this is perfectly natural, and people do make choices at different times, and in a way, whilst it might seem like there's a need to hurry, there isn't really. And if you, so I was just reading an article fairly recently where they're contemplating changing the retirement age and adding another year on. So let's say it's 71. That's still a long time. And if you look at the majority of time that you spend as a doctor is not in training. And therefore, spending that time to kind of get it right and make those decisions right for you has a knock-on benefit in terms of how you'll feel later on when you're kind of doing it for a long time. Let's hope not. And I think the other thing is that recognizing that what was traditionally seen as the main important parts of a career aren't like that anymore. And this comes back to that concept of having that self-analysis and reflection. And when I talk about self-analysis and reflection, for me, there's kind of three components to that. One of the components is a lot more straightforward, which is, well, you know, I'm learning all of these skills as a medical student and foundation doctor. Great, but which of them do you want to use? And I'm not talking here about the clinical skills. I'm talking here about the kind of what we'd call the soft skills or the personal skills. So things like, you know, how do you feel about communication and using communication? In what context do you enjoy that? How do you feel about the ability to kind of organise and manage? How do you feel about the ability to risk assess a situation? And think about what you enjoy doing, not necessarily what you can, because you can do all of these things, but it's about what kind of gives you that feedback loop of, I really enjoy doing this. This is what makes me happy. The second part of that is about what really motivates you, which is kind of what we're talking about at the moment. And then the final part is, what do you need and what is really important to you? And I guess I think to give you an example of what I mean there is kind of like geography. Do you need to be in a certain area? There's an increasing recognition that more recently, and I would say this has gone back the last 10 years, that geography is much more important than it used to be. A lot of your more senior colleagues will have moved to follow a job and a job opportunity, and that's becoming increasingly less the norm. And it's about, what can I get here because I want to be based here, because this is where all the things that I find are important. So again, kind of reflecting on this slide here, it's not just about what was traditionally seen as important, about the status and the salary and the income, and it's about that work-life balance concept, and also about doing something that you like doing, and also something that allows you to stay fit and healthy in your own right. And you know, if I think back on some of the conversations that I've had with doctors in training who are wanting to leave their particular training program and go on and do something else, I would say that approximately 50 to 60% of that is to do with how it's impacting on their own health. And often it's because they haven't been through that process of thinking about what is really important to them. They've followed what they thought was the appropriate pathway. And as most doctors will do, stuck at it until it's become untenable. And so I think just having a recognition of that is really important, because it allows you to kind of bypass any of these issues as you get further on. Of course, it's not a foolproof process, and there will be people who go into things that might not necessarily suit them immediately. And I guess also to recognise that there's always going to be things in a particular job that some of us don't enjoy, but you've got to do it because it's part of your job, and it's about having that balance of what is really important to you, and that you'll cope with the rest of it. So thinking back to that concept of motivation, that's more about kind of what is intrinsically valuable to you. So here's some examples that might make sense in terms of what I mean here. So for example, if you think back to when you apply to medical school, for those of you who apply to a UK medical school, you probably said roughly the same things in your personal statement. I used to interview for a local medical school, and the personal statements were all very similar themed in terms of what people want to do, and it was all about how you wanted to help people, and how you're really looking forward to the privilege of being able to look after people's health. Okay, that's what you said at medical school. How's that changed? How do you feel about following patients through their care pathway? Are you someone who wants to follow them through their care pathway? Are you someone who wants to kind of just fix them and pass them on to someone else? None of them are wrong, but it's about what's important to you. When someone says, I feel like I want to have accomplished something at the end of the day, right, okay, what does that mean to you? What does that accomplishment look like to you? Are you someone who's quite kinesthetic? Do you like to use your hands, that kind of stuff? Do you like the variety, or do you like something that is fairly stable and routine and you're able to manage that process? All of these are individual, and there'll be a lot of shared commonality, but some of them, but with different extents depending on different people. And of course, lifestyle and salary is important to everyone, but the balance and the requirements are different depending on where you sit on this. And then think about what you find interesting. And again, this comes back to that concept of job and career. So for example, these aren't mine necessarily, but think about what is it that you've learned about yourself in terms of what draws you and what pulls you in that direction. Now, that might not necessarily be something that you end up doing as a career, but it's important to recognise that you've got that interest, and how do you maintain that? And of course, in some of this, it's not necessarily maintaining them as part of your job, but maintaining them as part of kind of like a portfolio career as you go through. And if you think about motivation, a lot of kind of motivation is wrapped up in what we're like as individuals and what we enjoy as individuals. So the other thing I just wanted to talk about briefly was that concept of personality and personality types. A lot of you will know all of this anyway, but I just want to highlight it with a particular reference to kind of careers and why that might be important to recognise. So probably the biggest used from in the career sphere is Myers-Briggs. If you haven't used it or haven't heard of it, if you do a quick Google search or any search engine of your choice, then you'll be able to find loads of stuff on there. There was some research done around this in terms of specialty choice in America many years ago, and essentially what it said was that there's all specialty types in every specialty, so it's not really useful in terms of choosing, but it's really useful in terms of that reflection and analysis about what is important to you and what you put value in. And so, it's worthwhile having a think about this. If, for example, you need a start of a 10 about, well, what is it that's important to me and why do I want to use it? So this is based on psychiatry, Jungian psychiatry, and it's this concept of everyone will have certain things that are preferences. It's preference-based, not behaviour, and that's really important when you're thinking about what's important to you. And it's got all sorts of different contexts in terms of what your leadership style is going to be like, this kind of stuff. But it's a really useful tool if you want to just reflect on the way that you kind of process particularly information and why some things may be more challenging than others in terms of the way that you process kind of your decisions and stuff like that. It has 16 different personality types. It's actually got a 5th dimension now, but there's just a pen profile of them all. And if you look at some of these kind of main headings, it kind of makes sense why some people are drawn to certain careers than others based on what they find is important. So that's that value system, that preference system. And so I'm quite happy to self-disclose here. So my MBTI type is INFP, which up there is the mediator. So the person who is kind and altruistic. I'm not necessarily sure I'm kind and altruistic, but certainly in terms of the mediator context, I get my sense of value from being able to kind of help someone move from one place to another and be able to negotiate the way through the process. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of how this might be important. It's just one of many, but I think thinking about the things that are important to you. And then reflecting upon what might be the opportunities going forward as well. And I think there's been an increasing system recognition that, going back to that slide earlier about the concept of don't give me a fixed pathway because I'm not going to engage with it. There is increasing work around flexibility in training, and you may very well be aware of this, enhancing doctors' working lives, which has been a piece of work that's been going on for several years now. And it kind of looks at the main themes that will be of benefit in terms of progression and careers for yourselves. So you've got, an increasing ability to do less than full-time training. You've got this concept of portfolio training that, if you weren't aware, is rapidly being spread out to a lot of specialties. And these are things where you do the majority of your clinical work in one specialty, but you've got either a day a week or a block where you might do something aligned to that. So, for example, these are things like clinical informatics, medical education, sustainability in healthcare. So it allows you to kind of go back to that concept of this is something I'm interested in, but might not necessarily align perfectly with my clinical career as I'm going forward. There's a new category of out of program, if you aren't already aware of that, and that gives you the option to step out and step back in, but by kind of demonstrating some of your curriculum outcomes, so you don't necessarily have to finish the same length of program. All of these are around that concept of trying to make things more flexible for individuals to progress through. It's certainly not the answer to everything, but I think just recognizing that there has been a bit of a change in terms of perception, and certainly in a lot of specialties there is a lot more people working less than full time, and out with of specialty as well, generally within work. Talked earlier about practical applications of all of this as well. So it's all very well and good me talking about you need to think about it, and it's important because, about your long-term career and career decisions and career happiness and all that kind of stuff. And I know that some of you are like, but that's all well and good, but how am I going to use this? Give me something practical to use it from. So I talked earlier about skills and what you find really important. And if you really wanted to look at, well, how am I going to use these? This is how the specialties rank, not necessarily in terms of importance, but certainly the way that they look at, or the way that they're kind of ranked in terms of the person's specification, the different skills. So you can see there's vast differences in some of them than others, and it kind of makes sense. So if you look at general practice, for example, the key thing here, and apologies if the colours aren't as clear, is this whole concept of empathy and sensitivity, which, if you look at the what it talks about, it's very much talking about the ability to build up a rapport with patients. Makes absolute sense, because that's the whole concept of GP, about building up that trust and relationship over many years with your patient population. And then if you look at others, so for example, public health, it's much more around that kind of concept of being able to work as part of a wider team, a multidisciplinary team, because it's that whole concept of working across different sectors Doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be empathetic and sensitive. It just means in terms of the core skills, it's not a requirement to do the job. So if you're thinking about what is important to you from a concept of skills, then this is a bit of an idea about how they map over to specialties. And of course, when you look at recruitment for anything else other than specialty post-foundation, it's going to be based on skills that are broadly similar, and each will be different. I think the other thing, if you want a practical application of all of this, is the increasing rise of values-based recruitment, which may be a relatively new concept for some people. So values-based recruitment is something that is relatively recent. It's an extension of what would be traditional recruitment, or what we would call competency recruitment. What I mean by that is someone asks you a question like, tell us about a time when you've used communication skills. Tell us about a time when you've managed a team. That's competency based. So give us an example of. Values-based is much more about the values of the organisation. So if anyone is thinking about doing something that isn't specialty training, so is thinking about doing a teaching fellow job or a locally employed doctor job in a trust or a hospital, they will have their own value list, and some of the interview may be based around what the concept of value to them are. And these are things like respect, dignity, treating colleagues well. Your understanding about what is important to you can map across to them, because they'll probably get asked about them. And certainly when you go to something like consultant interviews, one local trust to us, their entire consultant interview process is predicated on values-based recruitment. Because once you're at that stage, and actually for a lot of the stages that you're in, they don't really care about your clinical skills because they know you've got them. That's why you're following a curriculum. It's much more about, well, how are you suitable to us? Have you thought about it? Is it important? Why is it important? Tell us how you match what we want. And of course, there's also those things that influence your career decisions, and no surprise here. Oh, sorry, no surprise here. It's that concept of the most important thing as far as research is concerned, is that it's experience, and the fact that you do it and you enjoy it, no brainer. However, there are lots of specialties, and some of you might not experience all of them. And so how do you then get an understanding of that? And that's where things like tasters can come in really useful. The second most important one, apparently, is your peers, colleagues and family, and I've seen that play out, and that can be a positive or negative influence. And the third one, which is really important, are role models and what you see. And I think one thing to recognise is that if you see a negative role model, they last longer. So I think just to be aware of that, and often challenge some of those role models, not personally, obviously. I don't want to have a little altercation on the wards, but again, challenge that in your head about, well, you know, this is someone completely different from me, and I don't necessarily fit what they want. And don't necessarily look at career progression based on the way that someone presents a career, because everyone's different, and everyone will do it in a different way. And there's all sorts of different options here, you know, so just to take some time to be aware of all the different things that you can do. It's not just about specialty training. You will know a lot of these things, but just take time to kind of think about it. And if you do want some time out after foundation, that's fine. You know, what tends to happen is that anyone who goes out after specialty training, the GMC data suggests that within 3 years, most people are back doing training. But it's what works for you, and I think when you want to do it, because it's about getting it right, and that's, you know, allows you to be in something that you enjoy. And then, you know, when you're thinking about managing kind of career decisions and what have you, you know, challenge yourself on what you know about what specialties are, and what the options are. So not just specialty, but what else is out there. And then, you know, kind of think about, well, why would it appeal to me, based on what you know about yourself. And almost in a converse way, well, I don't want to do that. Well, why? Because actually understanding what we don't enjoy can help us kind of reflect on what we might. So if you're in a state where I've not enjoyed anything, right? Okay, well, what is it particularly that you've not enjoyed on a day-to-day basis? Flip it around. What might that mean for the future? And if you want a bit of help, then there are kind of tools out there that you can use to help make some career decisions. I think they're useful as an exploration. I wouldn't necessarily use them as the thing that tells you what to do for the rest of your life. So you've got the BMA Specialty Explorer tool and the Sci 59. And I think if you're a BMA member, you get a free go at the Specialty Explorer tool, but it's worthwhile having a go at that and just having a bit of an idea about what that might mean. I think often it's really useful to look at this and then reflect on, well, why is it chosen those? Because often it will tell you why. And that's usually more useful than the list, because it gives you a bit of an insight into what kind of things you are raising in terms of the questions that they ask. They're all based on kind of multiple questions on a kind of Likert scale of whether you like it or not. And I just want to finish off by having a quick gallop through the kind of things, if you are wanting to do specialty training, this is particularly for those who maybe want to go straight into specialty training. So as you're probably already aware of, we've seen this before, that's the current training structure. These are the kind of specialty training choices that are open directly from F2. And kind of broken down into core and run through, and ones that are pilots, so might not necessarily be running everywhere, but might be running in kind of random places just to see whether there's any interest. You notice there that IST for last year wasn't running, and that's integrated. And GP with public health is a relatively new one as well, in terms of dual CCT as part of that. The recruitment process is quite long and involved. I'm not necessarily going to go through this here because you can access this every year from the specialty training website, and I will send a copy of these slides if anyone wants to have a look at them afterwards. And if you weren't already aware, you've got various different recruitment methodologies that are working in recruitment and training. So you've got the MSRA, which is a bit like the SJT, some self-scoring assessment, we're using particular criteria, a shortlisted application form, which is the way that you would apply for things outside of training, and in some an interview, and if it's outside of training, then it will be an interview. And this is just a quick overview of how it worked last year based on what specialty did what. Again, I'm not necessarily going to go through these, and you can have a look at these in your own time and leisure, but I think it's just worthwhile recognising that in some of them there's more of an onus on being able to provide evidence of commitment from then on. And what does that evidence look like? I guess this is just some suggestions of the kind of things that they look at. So it's things like your teaching, it's things like have you done presentations, have you been involved in an audit? Often the score is based on what level of achievement you have in here, recognising the level that you're at. And again, things like being able, if you go on a taster, being able to provide evidence of that, to show commitment, any reflections that you might have where you're talking about careers, for example, and things like supervisor reports are often really good evidence of particularly skills. Think about you know, your MSF tabs as well. They're often really good evidence of how other people view you as well. So I think this is the kind of things to think about, particularly if you've got a process where you're going to have to provide evidence. This is where you're going to be able to get it from. I'm kind of coming towards the end of the time that I had this afternoon, so I just wanted to kind of end on a final note by saying there are some people who will be able to kind of just go straight ahead. They're in the fast lane, they know what they want to do, they'll crack on with it, not a problem, they're very focused. That's great. If that's not you, don't measure yourself by them. Everyone goes at their own pace and will make decisions in their own time. And, you know, have conversations with people around you, have conversations with your educational supervisors. Have a think about what is important to you. Access any support that might be offered in your foundation school as well. There are kind of there's information on the CopMed Careers website in terms of some of the things that might be important to consider There's various different resources out there that you can access if anyone is considering things like specialty trainers, a specialty training website. If you're thinking about what the alternatives for medicine might be, there's websites out there that will give you that information. But I don't think you don't necessarily have to do this in isolation. Have a chat with each other and have a chat with your supervisor to find out about that. And you will get to where you want to be whenever it is right for you. And I think that's a key message I want you to take away from today, is that it's important to reflect, it's important to think about what's important to you before you even get the stage of starting to write down your menu. And then, whilst there's a career structure out there which gets you from A to B, your route from A to B might be longer than others, and that's absolutely fine. And I hope that has been of some use for yourselves. More than happy to answer any questions. There may have been some coming through as I've been talking, so apologies for that. I can't see questions. If we don't get through all of the questions, then we will be providing some feedback afterwards. So I shall stop sharing now and happy for any questions.
Mike, you must have answered everything so perfectly clear that there's no questions coming through.
Fantastic. Always good.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mike. That was a really useful and informative talk. Anybody who's attended, good evidence for your foundation professional capability number 13 for your portfolio. Hopefully it's given you a bit of insight into your career choices, possible choices, and perhaps a bit of thought about how you might approach that. I'm going to thank Mike and Gemma for their input and for Tamika for making it all work. This webinar will be on the UKFPO website, hopefully in a couple of weeks. So anybody that's missed it will be able to catch up on it. And if you've missed previous webinars, they're also on the UKFPO website. I would also say that we have a careers page on the UKFPO website again. It doesn't contain huge amounts of information, but it does signpost to a variety of areas, including, I believe, the MDRS site. In fact, there is one question that has just popped in. I'll let Mike have a look at that one.
Okay, so the questions come through about if you take a year out, do you need to have evidence for revalidation or an ARCP setting? So I guess it depends on what you're doing. So if it's an F3 year, often F3s are based in a hospital or a trust, and you won't necessarily do an ARCP as that because it's not a training program. However, it may be worthwhile keeping evidence of that if you wish, and I'm no expert on revalidation here, so someone else might be able to kind of answer me here, but in terms of revalidation, if you want that year to count, then you'll need to have an appraisal. So there'll need to be evidence of you being appraised during that year. If you don't, then that's not necessarily a bad thing, because when it comes around your next revalidation cycle, then they can kind of delay it for a year, and that doesn't have a negative impact. But feel free to correct me, anyone on the panel.
Yeah, I mean, you need some sort of appraisal every year as part of your GMC registration. In training, that's an ARCP. If you're not in training, you will need to have some sort of appraisal and provide evidence to continue with your medical licensing. There's a question on evidencing for the e-portfolio. I'll field that one. You can put it down as a reflective note. You can put it in your learning log, and you can mention it in your summary narrative.
There's another question about being excluded from training if we apply for training later after doing several years of trust grade jobs. I think the There are some rules around entry points into specialty training, particularly around levels of experience. Now, this fluctuates every year, and it's based on, so you would need to check whichever specialty it is that you're interested in. In previous years, it was very much based on if you had more than 2 years experience, then you couldn't necessarily get in directly at the start, but that doesn't mean there's only one entry point. There's different entry points. And if you look at some of the curriculum maps, which you can access on the GMC website, it shows you the different curriculum entry points that you can have. So to give you an example, if you were thinking about applying to something like a medical specialty, it may be that your entry point, if you've done several years, won't be into IMT. It'll be into a higher specialty training because you've got the equivalent of that in terms of experience. So there's kind of a document that you can go through to evidence that. So I guess it's specialty dependent, I suppose, is the easiest way to say that. So you need to check the person's specification for whichever specialty that you want to kind of apply to, unless anyone else has got something to add to that.
I'll just add on top of that, just to let you know that the experience is post-foundation as well, so it doesn't include any of your rotations, and it is full-time equivalent. So if I give you an example, surgery has an 18-month rule. If you go and do a teaching fellow for a year and it's 50% teaching and 50% surgery, that's only 6 months equivalent experience, and then you could carry on and do more up to 17 months and 28 days, and then you stop doing surgery and you do something else. The experience rule as well doesn't mean that that's the only amount of time that you can take a break between training. You can take more than that. It's just particular that you can't do any more experience in that specialty. You could do 17 months of surgery and then you could go and do emergency med or medicine or something else, and that would still be okay. I think that answers the question. Shall we move on? There's another one there if you want me to go through that.
Yeah, there's the one about the MSRA.
Do you have to be invited for the MSRA? So you can't sit the MSRA test, multi-specialty recruitment assessment, unless you have a live application form in. So you would need to apply once you've put your application form in. If the specialty that you're applying for requires you to sit that, and not all specialties do, but if it does, you would get an invite come through Oriel and to your email as well, whichever email you used for your application, and it would ask you to register with the test centre and set you up to be able to book an MSRA test.
I can see there's a question here about documentation for taking time out and your revalidation. There's not a portfolio system. It'll be trust dependent, the documentation that they use.
Lots of trusts in England do allow you to use the Horus portfolio system. Others don't. If you're thinking of going into a particular specialty, then some specialties will allow you to access their portfolio, even if you're not actually in a training program at this stage, but if you're gathering evidence to enter one.
There's a question here about whether the progression into specialty training is because of a lack of opportunity rather than people's conscious choices. I think there'll always be elements in some specialties where it's to do with competition, because there are some specialties that are more competitive than others. I do suspect that the majority of it is individual choice rather than having to do it. I think the people who have to do it are in the minority. I think the majority of people do it because they want to. In terms of the training process and what is kind of helping people get in, I mean, I think, they look at the person's specifications every year to make sure they're appropriate, and the recruitment process changes every year to make it more appropriate. If I think back 10, 15 years, everyone had an interview, everyone had to go through assessment centre processes, and they've moved on from that to try and make it easier. So I think the first answer is it's probably more choice than it is forced. And the second is that they look at the recruitment processes every year. There is actually I talk about this as the MDRS careers group. There's an MDRS recruitment group that looks at all of this each year. Gemma, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Oh, just that I think it is recognised that there will be more specialty training posts in the future, because that came through the NHS plan that's just been released as well. So we'll hopefully see more posts.
There's a question about CREST forms. I'm not absolutely certain. Foundation, or if you've completed foundation program, then most of the specialties expect you to have applied within the last 3.5 years, or to provide evidence that you've had ongoing training. You'd have to check it for CREST, but I would imagine if you've had a CREST form signed, that would last for a similar period, unless others on the panel know that I'm wrong there.
As far as I'm aware, and this is something that I would need to check with our recruitment colleagues, but as far as I'm aware, a CREST is for 1 year only.
Oh, is it right?
So if you have a CREST and you have to get one for the next recruitment cycle, if it's the following year, then you'll need to redo the CREST.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike.
There's one there, Tony, I'll let you answer about whether this counts as core or non-core learning.
This is non-core learning.
There's also one about how common is F3, F4, F5. Since the training jobs haven't been able to keep up with the amount of foundation dogs. I mean, that will increase as we go forward. That's one of the commitments in the long-term workforce plan. Again, I think F4, F3, F3, F4, F5 is more to do with people's choice. It's, you know, it's not necessarily something that's forced onto people. I don't think I know of very many trainees, particularly in our area, who have done that because they've had to. There will be some, because it's a recruitment process, and therefore people will get in or will not get in, depending on, I guess, some of the stuff we've talked about this afternoon, and how much they've kind of put into that. But you know, training programs will increase. However, there's also a big piece of work around where those training posts should be. So that, you know, it's worthwhile keeping an eye on some of the geographical distribution work that's going on.
Do you know anything about the number of doctors that defer by a year because they don't get into training? I'm not aware of any data on that, but
no, there's no recent research on any of that. Actually, our data into career destinations, it's 2020. The last ones we stopped collecting the information for COVID at the time, and I'm not sure if the JMC has picked that back up.
We do know that some don't. We do know that there are various strategies. You can apply for more than one specialty if you're looking to do specialty, and a lot of people do that. So that's an option for particular geographies. Some people do come back and reapply. Cardiothoracics, there's about 12 training posts a year, and if you come number 13 or 14 in the ranking, you might well think it's worth going back and having another go a year later with a bit more experience. The final question, I think we better stop after this one. There's a final question on special circumstances. Gemma or Mike?
I can't see where that question is. There's too many in the log now.
Is there a process for special circumstances when applying to stay locally for training?
Off the top of my head, I can't. There is special circumstances, and it is, yeah, there's certain categories that come under for being able to apply for that geography. But all of that will be on the database, which is on Oriel. So the forms will be there if someone wants to go in and have a look at what the eligibility criteria is. Yeah, and the specialty training website is the one that's got a lot of information on about this process, and that will link you to other websites. Right, with 3 minutes to the hour, I'm going to thank our presenters again. I thought it was a fabulous talk, and well, I think the number of questions afterwards shows how interested people are in this. So thank you very much to Mike and Gemma. Thank you to our audience. As I say, if you want to go through this again, or you want to pass the information on to colleagues, then you'll find that it's on the UKFPO website in a few weeks' time. Thank you all very much. Thanks to Mika. We'll finish here, shall we?